All right, here we are. Hello, welcome to Wednesday. You're watching a live taping of the Faithwire 4 and 3 podcast. We are about to start that taping in just a moment with myself, Dan Andros, and Goins-Phillips from Faithwire.com. It's been a fiery week for me, Trey. I was fired up yesterday, fired up again today, and all I'll say is the big tech sensors are on my mind here. Throwing a monkey wrench into the day. I mean, that's just what they're doing. That's what they're good at doing. So you're on mute still, by the way, if you're going. So
there we go. I'm here now. I was gonna say that I decided to wear my a Hawaiian shirt, hopefully to lift your spirits. You know, okay. Summer is on the way, Dan. So
yes, I should just soak in some sunshine and not let these social media gatekeepers ruin my day.
Just have a Mountain Dew and
I do that. That's on the checklist. For those who know me well, this is my blood is
your go-to
80% Mountain Dew. So, that's how I survive. That's when you know God has made an awesome creation, is when you can have a diet like I have, and somehow it makes your body work. Like donuts and Diet Mountain Dew and cookies. It's wild. So
the diet of champions.
Yeah. But I mean, look, think about how awesome that is. God made our bodies that can run on stuff like this if you want. I mean, it's not optimal. I'm not saying it's the best thing to put in. It's like putting sludge in your car or something. Yeah. So, all right. No more diet tips. Okay. Let's fire this thing up here. I'm going to start the taping in just a sec.
Faithwire.com.
Hello and welcome to 4 and 3, a podcast breaking down 4 of the most important stories of the day and 3 things you need to know about them, all from a Christian perspective. Today's Wednesday, May 26, 2021. I'm Dan Andros. Coming up on the podcast today, a shock study finds that evangelical support for Israel is plummeting. Plus, Chip and Jo, man, they got attacked for a misrepresented political donation, and misrepresented for a political donation. We got the details on that. It's just Chip and Jo under fire again. It's just sad. So here's another state, by the way, has become the latest to ban CRT in schools. We'll have the critical race theory. We'll have the details on that. And Georgia Governor Brian Kemp has banned so-called vaccine passports in his state. All those stories and more with Goins-Phillips from Faithwire.com. Trey, how's it going?
I'm good. This might be crazy and a little bit too Pollyanna-ish of me, yeah. But I kind of get the impression that maybe the tide is starting to turn on CRT, which would be would be nice. I don't know.
Yeah, I've had this term I've coined called pendulum watch, and I just feel like after George Floyd, we talked about it yesterday, that just something shifted in the narrative, whereas like a lot of Democratic sort of far left activist things that they've been pushing for all of a sudden just became accepted in mainstream. Everyone's like, yeah, let's have that I'm just wondering when the pendulum will shift back to the middle a little bit more. And maybe this is a sign. So we'll see. But we'll have the details on all that and more. And we're going to dive right into story number 1. And this is a shock study here of evangelical Christians in the U.S., and they've long been very supportive of Israel. But this new survey shows that defense might be beginning to unravel. So the poll was conducted by Barna Group. It found that only 33% of young evangelical Christians from ages 8 to 29 said that they support Israel. And in the conflict between Israel and Palestine. So that's a steep drop off from the 69% of young evangelical Christians who said during another survey conducted in 2018 that they sided with Israel. That same survey found of the 1,000 respondents that 75% defended Israel. 3 years ago, just 3 years ago, only 2.8% of poll participants pledged support for Palestinians. Now, 24.3% said they sided with Palestinians. That is a massive increase over just a couple of years. And so this study comes on the heels of overwhelmingly one-sided reporting on the Israel-Gaza conflict. For example, most every report, this is just one kind of angle of this that you see, says Israeli police used excessive force on Palestinian worshipers. That's how this whole thing started, this latest Israel-Gaza conflict. So they omit the fact, all of them pretty much, that the worshiping had ended, and it was some who remained that ended up protesting and shooting fireworks and throwing rocks and causing disturbances at nearby police stations and other people in the area. And that's sort of what kicked and provoked things off. And so, you know, you can argue the level of the response from there, but to just say that Israeli officers were just going after worshipers for no reason is fake news, as they say. So what's the left saying? Well, the left has long criticized Israel and called them the oppressor, and the headlines and the overwhelming that one-sidedness might be actually paying off for him now at this point for far-left activists, because it seems that that support is starting to erode for Israel. So what's the right saying? Well, the right, especially the Christian right, is kind of blindsided by this poll, as support for Israel is laid out in Genesis very clearly. It's a common teaching among evangelical Christians. So why does it matter? Well, if the evangelical church is losing their support for Israel over the next now and then in the years to come, that doesn't likely bode well for our long-term future relationship with the nation of Israel. So time will tell if this is a harbinger of things to come or just an outlier. But Trey, this is certainly a disturbing poll.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a confluence of a couple things. I think some of it is the reporting, like you said, and how Israel is pretty much, if you look at any mainstream outlet, every single time Israel will be described as the aggressor. Yeah. Like that's just kind of a given. That's going to be how the media reports it. But I think also in a lot of Christian culture, we don't really put much emphasis on the Old Testament anymore. So we don't really know the history of the Jewish people. Like I had a professor when I was in community college, before I transferred to a Christian university. This community college professor, she's one of my literature professors. She's not a Christian at all. And she said, we were talking about books being banned or certain books being inappropriate to use in secular government-funded institutions. And she said, the fact of the matter is that the Old Testament is a history book for the Jewish people. Like she said, I'm not using it as a religious text, but it is something that needs to be considered when you're looking at the history of the Jewish people, because this is their written history. It's their oral history that's been turned into written history. So, I think we don't really put as much emphasis as we should maybe in Christian cultures or in our Christian culture, particularly with the younger generation, and really helping them understand the Old Testament and the heritage of the Jewish people. So I think a combination of a few things has led to this shift, but it's certainly something that needs to be turned around, and it's concerning to see support among evangelical believers dwindling.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's incumbent on churches to make sure that they're not just glossing over this, and this area of teaching, and to make sure their congregants understand it, because all of the information that's just being flooded with people, as we talked about, is so one-sided that if you don't teach that, there's a good chance that people are going to get wrong views on some of these things as far as it pertains from a Christian worldview. So,
yeah, absolutely. All right, story number 2. So Chip and Joanna Gaines, the HGTV stars, who are now doing their own show on Discovery Plus, I think. So anyway, they found themselves at the center of yet another kind of made-up controversy that was spun by the news media. So according to the Dallas Morning News, Chip recently made a $1,000 campaign contribution to his sister, Shannon Braun, who's running to be on the board of the Grapevine Colleyville Independent School District. So many... like many other people, Braun is opposed to critical race theory being implemented into school curricula. In a campaign video, she pledged she would, quote, vote down anything and everything that further promotes CRT in schools and actively work to remove any CRT currently in the school system. The Hill, as you can see in the screenshot if you're watching online, immediately ran a misleading headline writing that Chip and Joanna Gaines, quote, donated to a campaign against critical race theory in schools. So while the headline is technically true, it's not fair or accurate to interpret what happened that way. Really, what happened is they made a political donation to a family member who happens to be conservative, who's running for the school board, and among many other things, she's opposed to critical race theory.
It's his sister. I mean, like, wow, yeah, shocking news. Guy donates to his sister.
Right. It's donated to a family member who's running for the school board. So she has, I would imagine, a whole host of positions. One of them happens to be in opposition to CRT. They did not donate directly to some sort of unknown campaign against just critical race theory. And like you said, Dan, it's his family member. So seems an important thing to note there. What's the left saying? Well, some leftist social media users immediately jumped at the opportunity to condemn the Gaines. One person called it disgusting, while another said the couple can't accurately even define CRT. Quite the assumption there about the couple. Others said that they will boycott anything the Gaineses make or sell from now on. And some even suggested that Joanna, who's of Korean descent, is betraying her ethnic heritage by being opposed to critical race theory, or even presuming she's opposed to critical race theory. Who knows? Maybe she has a different opinion from her husband. We don't really even know, but I can probably guess where she falls on the issue. So what's the right saying? Well, conservatives are praising the famous couple for their contribution to Chip's sister, while also calling out the media for misrepresenting the donation, again, to his sister. One person called the news refreshing, while another added that they love them even more now. So why does it matter? Dan, I just think this is a perfect example of how the media will tweak the focus of the story just enough so that it says something completely different and will engender an even more divisive response because, it's technically true, but really not in the spirit of what actually happened. And good for the Gaineses for doing whatever they want to with their money because that's their business. The lesson I hope Americans are learning is that whether you're Democratic or Republican leaning, none of us should take the media's word really for anything. Like we've talked about yesterday, we need to be investigating and reading up on stuff on our own as best we can because we should always assume that there's a bias or a motive behind the news that we're reading and the way that it's been reported to us.
I mean, I'm looking at that headline, and in the context of what I'm dealing with today behind the scenes here with these, social media dings where they, slap a misinformation label on it. We talked about it yesterday. Here on this podcast, and then you see a headline like that. That's not what he did, as you said. Like, he didn't donate to a campaign against critical race theory in schools. There is no campaign against he donated to his sister, who, like you said, happens to have that view. I mean, that's just obnoxious. That breaking news, man donates and supports his family member. I mean, it's just insanity. But I think, like you said, they're just trying to divide. The media is just trying to divide. They know it's going to stir up clicks, and it's sad. It's sad and pathetic.
Well, and we've seen them do this to him before, to the Gaineses before. I can't remember what year it was, but a couple of years ago, there was reporting that the Gaineses go to a church that's, homophobic.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, okay. So when you look into it, it's like, oh, they just hold to a biblical view of marriage, which is mainstream, that the majority of churches across the world hold to.
I mean, what kind of a headline?
They'll take advantage of the fact that a lot of people are not going to read it, and they'll just, look at the headline and think, oh my goodness, they're going to this church that's actively discriminating and hating on gay people.
Right. They go out.
That's not actually what's happening.
Yeah, they don't meet and worship in church on Sunday. They just go out and they actively target LGBT people. That's all Chip and Jo are doing every weekend. I mean, it's absurd. But it seems like the media does lap up a lot of these leftist activist talking points these days. So, as you said, hopefully, maybe we can, get the pendulum swinging the other way just a little bit.
Yeah.
So. All right, let us head into story number 3. And Tennessee, they've become the latest state to take a stand against critical race theory in schools. The new legislation says that teachers can't teach that, quote, an individual by virtue of the individual's race or sex is inherently privileged, racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or subconsciously. They also added language that allows impartial discussion of controversial aspects of history, such as slavery and such, making sure that that's obviously still allowed under it. And the limits on teacher speech won't apply when a teacher is responding to a student's question or referring to a historic figure or group. So if a school is found in violation, they could get fined. They could lose some of their state funding. So there's some good incentive there to follow it as well. Won't just get a slap on the wrist. So Governor Bill Lee signed the measure into law earlier this week and said students should learn things that don't, quote, inherently divide people. We need to make sure that our kids recognize that this country is moving toward a more perfect union, that we should teach the exceptionalism of our nation and how people can live together and work together and make a greater nation, and to not teach things that inherently divide or pit either Americans against Americans or people groups against people groups. That was the governor speaking there. Similar proposals targeting the teaching of CRT, which Christian theologian Voddie Baucham and other critics call a worldview and a religion in and of itself, have been introduced in 16 states. Idaho and Oklahoma enacted laws this year as well. So what's the left saying? Well, the left's been kind of pushing CRT to have it in corporations, in schools, even in churches. And we've even seen some evangelical churches adopt this idea as they, Matt Chandler is a pastor. That's one example that we have there. He's spoken of white privilege often. The SBC adopted a resolution on CRT and said, while acknowledging that, quote, critical race theory and intersectionality alone are insufficient to diagnose and redress the root causes of the social ills that they identify. Sites have been speaking out on this issue. Dana Lash, one of them, in that area. Actually, she's in that town where Chip and Joe's sister is running. Voddie Baucham has been perhaps a leading voice on this front, especially when it comes to churches. And Trey and I interviewed Voddie recently about his new book, Fault Lines, which is must read on this issue. And you can check out that interview over on the CBN News YouTube page. So why does it matter? Well, Baucham said that this ideology is, quote, a wolf in sheep's clothing. So he says it's antithetical to the gospel. And there's no grace there. There's no redemption there. There's no salvation. Yet by adopting it, it's going to automatically divide us. Certain people are going to be called the oppressors. They're going to be called, the bad, basically, for just the color of their skin, by virtue of the color of their skin. So I don't think that's the way the country wants to go, Trey. And, if we want to move in a direction that was more in Martin Luther King's model, I think this poses a challenge to that, quite honestly.
Yeah, I think also there's kind of an interesting thing happening with people like John Lennon's son, or even Sarah Silverman a little bit, and Barry Weiss, like I've mentioned before. And I actually think Christopher Rufo, I'm pretty certain that he identified as more Democratic leaning, but was just so opposed to the CRT stuff that he came out and is really active on that front. So it's interesting that it seems like there's this like cadre of people who are kind of coming together. It's like a motley crew of conservatives and more left-leaning people who are coming together to oppose this. And it's interesting that it's creating I guess a bridge between the two ideologies.
Yeah.
So I just hope more people will start to stand up and do that. But it is encouraging to see people more and more from both sides of the aisle saying, hey, we disagree on this and this, but we can agree that this is an issue. And this is not the way to address racism or to address bigotry or, prejudice, whatever it is. So I'm glad to see more people hopefully raising their voices, and also more states and legislative bodies coming out and saying, hey, we're obviously opposed to racism, but this is not the way to do it because it's more divisive than helpful.
Yeah, and that seems to be the rub on a lot of it, is that it's nobody's against addressing racism. Everybody,
sure,
except for actual racists, don't want racism. But this approach just doesn't, especially from a Christian worldview, it does not appear to have, as Voddie says, any redemptive value to it, any grace component whatsoever. It's just hey, realize that you're bad and that, you have privilege and you don't. And this is just the way it is. And, then be an anti-racist, whatever that means. There's just there's no clear end in sight on that front. And so you just got to wallow in your either privilege or your oppressed state. So it just seems like it only serves to divide us. So.
Well, and I think too, just on a like shallow, basic level, any sort of worldview that's going to make presumptions based solely on the color of someone's skin is already by default incompatible. I think with the gospel.
Indeed.
So, all right, story number 4. So, in a new executive order, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp has banned requiring people to have so-called vaccine passports to get into the southern state. So the decision by Kemp comes as more businesses and venues are dropping their COVID-19 restrictions a couple weeks after the CDC announced that vaccinated people can safely stop wearing their masks. Places are still encouraging non-vaccinated people to wear masks. Most places, though, are not requiring any sort of proof of vaccination, at least not at this point. So Kemp told Fox News this week, "I thought it was important for the state government to signal we're not going to have vaccine passports. People know what to do. We're going to continue to encourage them to get the vaccine. There are a lot of concerns out there that people are going to be forced to do something with their own medical decisions," he added. "We do not support that in Georgia." So the governor's executive order comes a few weeks after he lifted most of the state's remaining pandemic restrictions, and more than 3.2 million Georgians, including Kemp, so far are vaccinated against COVID-19. But the governor said forcing people to do something is not going to work. You need to get them to buy in to what you're selling and what the solutions are. So what's the left saying? Well, several on the left have strongly encouraged businesses, states, and venues to mandate proof of vaccination for entry. Feminist activist Jill Filipovic said this month, "The country needs to implement vaccine passports immediately." She wrote, "If you don't want to get vaccinated, that's your right, but it's not your right to go to a concert, to go to a bar, a restaurant, or a large event." And Dr. Fauci recently said that he believes airlines and cruise ships will soon begin requiring proof of vaccinations for customers. He said colleges and universities will likely do the same. Some already are. He also complained about the fact that there are no vaccine passport mandates from the government, saying, "The trouble is that we don't have vaccine passports, so we don't know who's vaccinated or not." The Biden administration has repeatedly said that they will not require them from a federal level. So what's the right saying? Well, conservatives have been opposed to this kind of overreach from the government and from big business from the beginning. One social media user responded to Filipovic, writing, "It's terrifying that someone can be so grossly authoritarian and insane in public, and people will actually agree with them." Even a former Bernie Sanders campaign staffer wrote that vaccine passports will, quote, "inflame the culture and lead to surveillance culture." So it's an interesting take from a Sanders staffer.
Yeah.
So why does it matter? This is the kind of power we should not be giving to our government and to big corporations. They don't need to determine so much of our activity. Vaccination is a personal decision that should be left to individuals to make for themselves and for their families. And here's the thing. The vaccine works according to all the data we have available to us. So those who choose to take the vaccine are protected from people who might choose not to get the vaccine. And as it stands right now, I was looking at the numbers this morning, Dan, half of all U.S. adults are now fully vaccinated, which is quite record break. I mean, that's happened super fast.
Yeah.
So it's time for the restrictions to end and for the overreach to stop. And I just think, if you're vaccinated, you're safe. So I don't really understand why we're still at this point being so driven and led by fear that we're willing to potentially, some people are encouraging the government to take this kind of restrictive measure.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're seeing all these things. Like, I think I just saw somewhere, someone sent me this story where they're doing like a lottery for a vaccine lottery, basically like handing out a lottery prize. If you're going out and you're getting your vaccine, you get entered into some sort of lottery. So there's all kinds of just this push for it to go on. And, and that's fine. But they're just, like you said, there doesn't seem to be any room for not getting it. So if someone chooses and they don't want to get it for whatever reason, there doesn't seem to be a safe space there for them. It's very much like this feminist activist, kind of trying to shun basically anyone who makes that decision. And that just, to me, doesn't seem very American. And I think that's why you see a lot of people pushing back, because they're just, they don't like this idea that we're sort of being forced to do things. And I know that the Biden administration has said they won't do the federal passport on the vaccine passport on a federal level, which is good. But almost more insidious is the fact that they're working, behind the scenes with all these big corporations that are sort of, they're trying to push it. So that was their tactic.
Yeah.
They knew there was like a non-starter to go, we're going to mandate it from a federal level. That just won't fly. So they go behind the scenes and try to get all these companies to force the issue. And, and then you're in that point where, well, it's a company's right to do what they want. They don't have to do it. So now you're kind of stuck there. You're kind of stuck on that fence there. Well, company's free to do what they want. So now it's just a matter of how many companies will actually do that and how many won't. So
on us as government officials, as healthcare officials, let's convince people, let's win them over to get the vaccine. Let's not try to force them into a corner, which I think is actually the effective way to convince people. And also, like you said, I think the frustrating thing, and maybe the it's kind of like the dirty secret here, is that the government knew, the federal government, the White House knew, well, we don't have to mandate it because big tech and big corporations are going to do all of that work for us. And it's kind of a loophole, like you said, because then they can say, well, that's a private business doing what they want to do. So, who are we to stop them? It's a frustrating game that a lot of our elected officials seem to be playing with this issue.
Yes, indeed. All right, that's all the time we have for today's episode, which, by the way, today's episode being featured on the Daily Rundown over on cbnnews.com and will be every Wednesday. So thank you to everybody from the CBN Daily News Rundown podcast that's checking us out today. Appreciate that. We will be back here with more news from a Christian perspective. As always, head on over to cbnnews.com and faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective. God bless. We'll see you back here tomorrow. Okay, and it happened today, Trey. It happened. If anybody was watching yesterday, I said one of these days I'm going to not hit the